Hey everybody, this is Perch, and here comes a question that I've talked about this many times before, but I do think it's one of the core elements about superhero comic books in particular that have caused them to struggle a lot more in recent time. Now, this is not a blanket statement, and everything that there's exceptions to every single rule. I just not get hung up in the exceptions. In general, I think this question hits upon something that is missing, so let's get into it. It says, "Can the big two just let villains be villains?" In fairness to the big two, I think this is a industry-wide problem, including the indies in a lot of cases. But the big two have established history, so makes sense to start there. Anyway, the question goes this way: Hey Perch, I'd love to hear your opinion on this article, and it's an article that's basically asking for, can please let women be villains. This appeared on a little bit ago on electricliterature.com, and it's basically making the case that if you really want deep, complex villains, then it's okay for women to be villains. You don't need to always have the female characters be sympathetic, or if they do villainous things, it's probably because they're being controlled by a man or whatever it happens to be, or there's some backstory that made them the way they are and everything else. And some people are starting to wake up to the idea of like, hey, women can be villains too. They can just be villains. And you're kind of taking away, if you're doing this for feminism reasons, you're actually taking away from women being strong characters when you reveal the only reason why they're sent down this villainous path is because some man broke their heart, dumped them, didn't buy them the right shoes, whatever it happens to be. This article is mainly talking, or it's written from the perspective of the film Cruella, where we get this deep backstory about Cruella and kind of how she came to be. But anyway, it's a good article, and I agree with the premise there. But the mail continues, says, specifically the idea and how it relates to modern comic books, not just female villains. I feel like writers are increasingly reluctant to write villains as malevolent beings. Rather, they write many most to be misunderstood or a victim of circumstance. I've always felt like the best villains are straight up evil Emperor Palpatine or Joker Green Goblin types because they test the character of our hero to their limits, and we root for their defeat, not their rehabilitation. I think that's a really clever point there at the end. In comics, I think this really started with Harley Quinn, and it's been compounding ever since. So, agree. I do think, like I said, there's a problem in comics. I've done videos in the past where villains there's this attempt to soft pedal the villain, that the villain is not truly villainous. They're misunderstood. There's reasons for it. There's a tragic backstory that drove them to this, and that's why we're involved in all this. And the effect is a bunch of things happen. One, you spend a bunch of your story in flashback because you're having to kind of walk the reader down the path of why this malevolent villain is doing malevolent things. And so you wind up spending a bunch of time in history talking time. And the other thing it does is like you want to set up a dynamic, particularly in superhero comics, where the hero has to, pull out all the stops to defeat the villain. And if you make the villain very sympathetic, or you make the villain very, pathetic, because that's where a lot of these backstories ultimately go, it's like, oh, this villain was dumped by a girl who said he was ugly and had a tiny dick, and so he decided to blow up France. And it's like, that it's hard to think this villain is a credible threat when this is, the situation that you've got. That's the challenge here. I think the other thing, though, is that it becomes a domino effect. If the villains get watered down, then the heroes facing the villains start to get watered down. You have to do more of like heroes fighting heroes, or heroes being having misunderstandings, or heroes having lunch and talking about what it was like when they used to fight villains. The more you do of that, the more jarring it suddenly becomes when a villain shows up who just wants to murder everybody. You're like, whoa, too far. You're like, hang on, too far. Well, see, like at various times, Doctor Doom has wanted to rule and or crack open the world. Ultron wants to murder all the fleshy beings and turn them into robots that is under his control. I mean, you can go there. Once upon a time, Rhino was like robbing banks and didn't care if he like speared somebody with that horn while he was doing it. Electro fried people on the ground. Green Goblin carelessly tossed people off villains. Sabretooth's ripping them open. I mean, anyway, villains used to murder, and lots of murder was kind of a big deal of villains. That was a goal. You didn't need for that to make a lot of sense. You didn't need to have some background as to why they're doing that way. Do we need to understand that once upon a time, Sabretooth was beaten by his dad, and that's why he's angry all the time, and then maybe he really wanted to get with, some Jean Grey lookalike from the 1800s, but Wolverine beat him to it, and so that's why. I mean, do you really, does this help? And it kind of goes to a different point of like all of the backstories and the character development and the plot points, all of that kind of stuff. It needs to be in service of the character. It needs to actually have a point to the greater good. In this case, the greater good is, where the character is going, what the character is doing, how it's evolving the threats and the story and the narrative. It should all be in service of that destination point. I think this predates Harley Quinn. Yes, they did turn Harley Quinn into a sympathetic villain, but part of this is kind of the general, era of, Alan Moore and Frank Miller and kind of this push that emerged during the 80s to kind of make. This is actually my theory. So in the 80s, you had some writers, the two of them. So Grant Morrison, certainly what he was doing later in Vertigo and other things, and you basically you went to give villains complexity, and that's not a bad thing. It wasn't a bad decision. It wasn't wrong of them to want to do that. But the goal was like, hey, let's give the villains some real complexity and some depth, and this will elevate them. And let's also do our part to deconstruct heroes and all the rest. And so you had people reading those stories who are not as talented as some of those people. And what occurred was the kind of watered down as people tried to replicate this lightning in a bottle that was Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns or some of these other stories. There became this desire to let's deconstruct the heroes and let's give some sympathetic plot lines to the villains. And in many cases, they go hand in hand. If we kind of gray the line of what's a hero and what's a villain, then before long, everything is this big muddy mess, and that's what we've got today. I think that the other thing that kind of occurred is you had these big stories come up in kind of the late 80s, and some of these writers here. I'm not blaming them, by the way. It's just that was the time, and that's what happened during that moment. And then I think the 90s shoved in because of the art revolution, because you had people like Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld and others who are doing this kind of art first approach. That also, when there's every time there's an action, there's a reaction. And one of the reactions to this kind of very, artist focused and in some cases superficial, not all of it. But, if you look at some of the Extreme Studios books, there wasn't a lot of depth in terms of what was going on there. But you may like it. It sold a ton of money, so I'm not, dissing it for that reason. But what happened was that the natural reaction to that whole period in time was to dive into, deep storytelling. And the last time we had that kind of deep storytelling that was put on a big stage was kind of Alan Moore and Watchmen and that kind of stuff. And so all of these things kind of combined to push us into an era where it was suddenly not enough to just have a villain want to blow up the world. I think it's why a lot of people currently like, Mark Millar's, King of Spies and some of the Magic Order and some of the stuff he's doing right now, because the villains are just evil. They're just out to blow stuff up. Do they have a tragic backstory? Maybe. Who cares? It doesn't matter to their journey. They're just evil, and the hero is set up to take them out. That's why I think those books resonate with a lot of people, because it feels like just heroes fighting villains, It doesn't need to be. It also doesn't feel like Mark has this deep-seated insecurity that if he doesn't write the villain to be sympathetic, that it's not a worthy story. I think, I also think editors contribute to this problem where they'll say, well, we got to give the villain more motivation to do this. But do you really? If you've established the villain is crazy and the villain wants to blow up New York, you don't need to give the villain motivation. The villain is crazy. You can't have every single story be a one-dimensional villain trying to murder everybody, but you can have some of those stories be that. The villains don't need to be more complex beyond they snapped. They no longer can tell the difference between right and wrong, and they're gonna kill a bunch of people, and the hero needs to stop them. It can be that simple. In many cases, with the way comics operate and kind of the quick in, quick out of stories, I mean, look, if you're looking at a market where it's hard to get more than 6 issues and 12 is a miracle as a writer, then I'd argue you're much better served going with some very simplistic villain's going to blow up the world and hero's got to stop it kind of storylines. I mean, you don't have 40 issues to tell the in-depth tale of how the villain got this way. You look at some of the villains in The Walking Dead, including Negan, who was one of the characters that really, I think, helped that whole series just jump to another bump. Negan was just evil. He was a bad character. He murdered people, and he seemed to enjoy doing it. And the character got a lot of, the character was well liked as a villain. Now, later down the road, Kirkman gave Negan some backstory of well, here's how he came, and here's where it all makes sense in his mind, and here's how we got there. He basically, put some of that stuff in there. But it was a long time. I mean, we're talking, I don't know, how many issues did it go before we even hinted at that with Negan? We had a good, several years worth of stories of that particular villain, and they didn't bother with anything other than character, Negan bad. That's it. Same thing with the governor and some of those other stories. Same thing with some of the work that Kirkman did with Invincible. You can certainly give some characters some backstory and some meaning, and that could make them more threatening or more well-rounded, certainly. But it's not essential for everything. And sometimes it really is a good idea to simply, let the villain be bad and roll out from there. I think that we are trapped in a place that because the villains are weaker, the heroes appear weaker. There's a lot more tell rather than show in comics, and all these factors just kind of keep compounding on each other, and that's one of the fastest way to snap some of this stuff back for superhero comics is let there be some sadistic, crazy, awful villains that are truly despicable, do bad things, and the hero has to rise to the occasion to beat them. And then certainly let the hero beat them. But I don't know, lately, like Marvel's been doing things where it's like it's trying to soft pedal, like, well, we got to explain why the Red Skull is the way he is. Like, or do you though? Just let the Red Skull be evil. You don't need to make him Jordan Peterson. You can just have him be evil because he wants to, he's pro-genocide. That's enough. You're good. Don't overcomplicate things. Anyway, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, villains are something that I'm passionate about. I think that they're a key part to comics. No, I'm not obsessed with villains. If you do it right, you can have a pretty damn good story on your hands. Thanks for writing, and thanks for listening.